Summer 1940. Europe lies at the feet of Adolf Hitler. France capitulated on June 22nd after 6 weeks of fighting that demonstrated the stunning effectiveness of the German blitzkrieg. The British Expeditionary Force was evacuated from Dunkirk, leaving virtually all its heavy weapons ashore. The Netherlands, Belgium, Denmark, and Norway are all occupied. Poland is divided between Germany and the Soviet Union. The Wehrmacht seems invincible. And now Hitler's gaze turns across the English Channel to the last remaining enemy still holding out, Great Britain. On July 16, 1940, Hitler issued Directive No. 16, which began with the words, "Since England, despite her hopeless military situation, still shows no sign of being willing to come to an understanding, I have decided to prepare and, if necessary, carry out an amphibious operation against England." The operation was codenamed Operation Sea Löwe, Sea Lion. According to the plan, German troops were to cross the English Channel, land on the south coast of England between Dover and Portsmouth, and then advance with the goal of encircling and capturing London. The plan was ambitious. The first wave of landings was to consist of approximately 100,000 troops, transported on hundreds of barges and towed vessels across the English Channel. They were to be followed by another 170,000 troops, 6 tank divisions, artillery, and engineering units. The total invasion force was planned to be between 300,000 and 400,000 men. It would be the largest amphibious operation in the history of the war to that point, larger than any operation conducted before. But Hitler and his generals faced a fundamental problem. Germany was a continental power, whose military machine was optimized for land operations. The Wehrmacht had the best tanks, the best tactics, and the best coordination between branches of the armed forces. But Germany had no experience conducting large-scale amphibious operations. Germany lacked specialized landing craft. And most critically, Germany lacked naval supremacy. The British Royal Navy was the most powerful navy in the world. Even after the losses suffered in the Norwegian campaign and the Dunkirk evacuation, Britain still had approximately 50 battleships and cruisers, over 100 destroyers, and numerous submarines and auxiliary vessels. The German Kriegsmarine, by contrast, was significantly weaker, especially after the losses in the Norwegian campaign, where the Germans lost several cruisers and numerous destroyers. In a direct naval confrontation, the Germans stood no chance against the Royal Navy. Therefore, the entire Operation Sea Lion plan relied on one critical condition. The German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, had to achieve complete air superiority over southern England and the English Channel. If the Luftwaffe could destroy the British Royal Air Force, RAF, and keep the British fleet at bay through air attacks, then the invasion would be possible. But if the Luftwaffe failed, the invasion would be suicidal. The barges carrying German soldiers would be sunk by British ships or destroyed by British aircraft long before they reached the British shore. Hitler understood this. His generals understood it. The Chief of Staff of the Supreme Command of the Wehrmacht, Colonel General Alfred Jodl, wrote in his notes, "An invasion of England without air superiority is suicide. We must either completely destroy the RAF or abandon the operation." But Hitler was unwilling to abandon it. He was confident the Luftwaffe could handle the task. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, assured Hitler that his air force could destroy the RAF in 2 to 4 weeks of intensive air raids. Göring was overconfident to the point of insolence. He believed the British Air Force was weak and demoralized, its pilots inferior to the German aces, and its aircraft obsolete. He promised the Führer that by mid-August, the skies over England would belong to Germany, and then the invasion could begin. But Göring was wrong. He underestimated the enemy. He didn't understand the scale of the British preparations over the previous years. He didn't know about the radar stations they had built along the coast. He didn't understand the tactics developed by the British fighter commander-in-chief, Air Marshal Hugh Dowding. And most importantly, he underestimated the British resolve to defend their homeland. In the summer of 1940, the Battle of Britain began. the largest air campaign in history at the time. Thousands of German bombers and fighters attacked British airfields, radar stations, ports, and cities. Thousands of British fighters scrambled to defend their skies. The outcome of this battle would determine the fate of Operation Sea Lion and perhaps the entire war. But Operation Sea Lion never took place. The barges assembled in French ports never crossed the English Channel. The German soldiers preparing for the invasion never landed on British shores. Britain survived. But this was not only due to the courage of British airmen or the wisdom of British command. It was due to a series of mistakes, accidents, bad decisions, and illusions that saved the country from invasion. This is the story of how technical problems, overestimation of one's own strength, and the vagaries of the weather prevented the largest invasion in European history. On June 22, 1940, in the forest of Compiègne, in the very same railway carriage where Germany signed the capitulation in 1918, ending World War I, France capitulated to the Third Reich. It was a moment of triumph for Adolf Hitler. In 6 weeks, the Wehrmacht had crushed an army considered one of the strongest in Europe. The French lost more than 360,000 men killed, wounded, and captured. The British Expeditionary Force was evacuated from Dunkirk, leaving virtually all its heavy weapons, tanks, artillery, and trucks on the French shores. Hitler was convinced the war in the West was over. France was defeated, Britain was isolated. Logic dictated that Britain, realizing the hopelessness of its situation, would attempt peace negotiations. The Führer was even prepared to offer Britain rather lenient terms: preservation of the empire, recognition of German hegemony in continental Europe, and renunciation of interference in European affairs. Hitler considered the British racially close to the Germans and hoped they would understand the benefits of cooperation. On July 19, 1940, Hitler delivered a speech to the Reichstag in which he made what he considered a final appeal to reason. He declared, "At this hour, I feel obliged to my conscience to once again appeal to England to reason and common sense. I see no reason for continuing this struggle." The Führer sincerely believed that the British would accept his proposal, that they would understand that continuing the war was pointless. But Hitler underestimated Winston Churchill. The new British Prime Minister, who came to power in May 1940, was not a man of compromise. Churchill hated Nazism with all his being. He saw Hitler as a threat not only to Britain, but to all civilization. On July 22, 1940, British Foreign Secretary Lord Halifax officially rejected Hitler's proposal, declaring that Britain would continue the fight until complete victory. Hitler was disappointed, but not surprised. He understood that if diplomacy had failed, force would have to be used. On July 2, 1940, even before the British officially rejected his peace proposal, Hitler ordered the Wehrmacht High Command to begin preliminary planning for the invasion of Britain. The operation was codenamed Sea Lion. However, Hitler was not enthusiastic about this plan. He was a continental strategist, a man who understood land warfare but had little understanding of naval operations. He was also preoccupied with the Soviet Union. As early as July 1940, Hitler began considering Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the USSR. For the Führer, Britain was an irritating problem that distracted him from his main goal, the conquest of living space in the East. Nevertheless, the order was given, and German generals began planning. Chief of Staff of the OKW, Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, Supreme Command of the Wehrmacht, Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, and Chief of Operations of the OKW, Colonel General Alfred Jodl, assumed overall planning of the operation. The commander of the ground forces, Field Marshal Walter von Brauchitsch, and the Chief of the General Staff of the ground forces, Colonel General Franz Halder, developed a detailed plan for the landing operation. On July 16, 1940, Hitler issued Directive No. 16 on the preparation of a landing operation against England. The directive began, "Since England, despite its hopeless military situation, still shows no signs of readiness for mutual understanding. I have decided to prepare, and if necessary, carry out a landing operation against England. The aim of the operation is to eliminate the English homeland as a base for continuing the war against Germany, and, if necessary, to occupy it completely. The directive established the general framework of the operation. The landings were to be carried out along a broad front between Ramsgate and West White, the area between Dover and the Isle of Wight on the south coast of England. The first wave was to consist of approximately 90,000–100,000 troops. The second wave would consist of another 170,000 troops. The plan was to involve 6 frontline infantry divisions, 3 tank divisions, 2 motorized divisions, and airborne units. However, Directive Number 16 also established a critical precondition. Preparations for the landing operation must be completed by mid-August. The British Air Force must be so weakened morally and practically that it can no longer exert any significant offensive force against a German invasion. This meant that without air superiority, the operation would not take place. Hitler summoned Luftwaffe Commander-in-Chief Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring and ordered him to develop a plan to destroy the RAF. Göring enthusiastically accepted the task. He was convinced that his Luftwaffe was the best air force in the world, that the British could not stand up to the German aces, and that after a few weeks of intensive air raids, the skies over England would belong to Germany. Göring promised the Führer that the RAF would be destroyed by mid-August. But Hitler had his doubts. He wasn't sure Göring could fulfill his promise. He wasn't sure an invasion was even necessary. A plan for war against the USSR was already forming in his mind. Britain was a problem, but not the main problem. The Führer hoped that Britain would understand the futility of continuing the war and negotiate, or that defeat in the air battle would force it to capitulate. For Hitler, Operation Sea Lion wasn't so much a necessity as a means of putting pressure on Britain, a threat intended to force it to agree to peace. When German generals began detailed planning for Operation Sea Lion, they quickly encountered the scale of the problem. Germany had never conducted large-scale amphibious operations before. The Norwegian campaign in April 1940 had involved amphibious landings, but these had been relatively small and carried out under conditions of surprise. The invasion of Britain was on a completely different scale. It was an attempt to transport an invasion force across one of the world's most dangerous straits, under threat from the world's most powerful navy. The first problem was logistical. How to transport 100,000 soldiers, their weapons, tanks, artillery, and supplies across the English Channel. Germany lacked specialized landing craft like those the Allies would develop by 1944 for the Normandy landings. The German Kriegsmarine lacked sufficient transport vessels. The solution was found in the use of civilian barges, which could be requisitioned from the inland waterways of Germany, France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. By August 1940, the German command had accumulated approximately 2,400 barges of various types and sizes in ports along the northern French coast: Boulogne, Calais, Dunkirk, Ostend, and elsewhere. These barges were river vessels designed for calm inland waterways, not for sea conditions. They had no motors. They had to be towed by tugboats. They had no protection from waves or wind. Engineers attempted to modify them, adding ramps for disembarking tanks and soldiers and strengthening the hulls, but this was improvised. Kriegsmarine Commander-in-Chief Grand Admiral Erich Raeder was categorically opposed to the operation. He understood that without naval supremacy, the operation was doomed. In a memorandum sent to the OKW, Raeder wrote, "I am categorically opposed to this operation. The British Royal Navy has overwhelming superiority over the Kriegsmarine. Even if the Luftwaffe gains air superiority, which is doubtful in itself, the British Navy will be able to destroy our barges long before they reach the British coast. It will be a disaster." But Hitler insisted on continuing the planning. Raeder was ordered to prepare the invasion fleet, despite his objections. Raeder complied, but continued to warn of the risks. In particular, he pointed to the weather. The English Channel is known for its unpredictable storms, high waves, and strong currents. Even in the summer months, conditions can quickly deteriorate. For river barges loaded with soldiers and equipment, even relatively slight swells can be fatal. Field Marshal von Brauchitsch, commander of the ground forces, and Halder, chief of the general staff, developed a detailed operational plan. The first wave of troops, approximately 90,000 strong, was to land on a front roughly 300 kilometers wide, from Ramsgate in the east to the Isle of Wight in the west. 6 infantry divisions of General Ernst Busch's 16th Army were to land between Ramsgate and Hastings. 4 divisions of General Adolf Strauss's 9th Army were to land between Brighton and the Isle of Wight. After securing the bridgehead, a second wave, comprising 3 tank divisions, 2 motorized divisions, and additional infantry units, was to be deployed to continue the offensive deeper into England. The ultimate goal was to encircle London and force the British government to surrender. The entire plan called for the operation to be completed within 2 to 4 weeks. However, this plan faced harsh criticism from the Kriegsmarine. Raeder pointed out that landing on such a broad front posed enormous challenges for logistics and defense. The Kriegsmarine simply did not have enough ships to protect barge convoys on such a wide front from attacks by the British fleet. Raeder proposed an alternative plan: a narrow landing front, approximately 50-60 kilometers, between Dover and Folkestone. This would allow for concentrated defense and minimize risks. But the Army Command objected to the narrow front. Halder wrote in his diary, "The Kriegsmarine's plan is not an invasion, it's a suicidal operation. Landing on a narrow front means our troops will be trapped in a small bridgehead, where they could be destroyed by British artillery and reserves. We need a broad front to create strategic depth and allow room for maneuver." The dispute between the Army Command and the Kriegsmarine continued throughout July and August. Ultimately, a compromise plan was adopted, landing on a front roughly 100 kilometers long between Folkestone and Eastbourne. This was still a wide enough front to create strategic depth, but narrow enough for the Kriegsmarine to provide some protection. However, everyone understood that even this compromise plan would only work if the Luftwaffe achieved absolute air superiority. Besides logistical and operational challenges, there was another critical issue: timing. The operation could only be carried out at a specific time of year. The English Channel becomes too dangerous to navigate after September, when autumn storms begin. Tides also played a role. Specific tidal conditions were necessary for the landing. Analysis showed that the optimal time for the invasion was the second half of September 1940, when tidal conditions would be favorable. This meant the Luftwaffe had only a few weeks, from late July to early September, to destroy the RAF and create the conditions for an invasion. If the Luftwaffe failed to accomplish this task by early September, the operation would have to be postponed until next year. The pressure on Göring was enormous. The entire Operation Sea Lion relied on one critical condition: the Luftwaffe's absolute air supremacy over southern England and the English Channel. Without this supremacy, the invasion was unthinkable. The British Royal Navy could have destroyed the invasion fleet in a matter of hours, if not neutralized by air attacks. British fighters could have attacked the defenseless barges carrying the troops. Therefore, Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, was given the most urgent task: destroying the RAF. Göring was overconfident. The Reichsmarschall believed his Luftwaffe was the best air force in the world. German pilots had combat experience gained in Spain, Poland, and France. German bombers, the Heinkel He 111, Dornier Do 17, and Junkers Ju 88, were modern and effective. German fighters, the Messerschmitt Bf 109, were among the best in the world. Göring promised Hitler that within 2 to 4 weeks of intensive raids, the RAF would be destroyed, and the British command would be forced to sue for peace. But Göring underestimated the enemy. The RAF, though numerically smaller than the Luftwaffe, was well trained and had several critical advantages. First, the British were defending their own territory. German fighters, flying from bases in France, had limited flight time over England, approximately 20-30 minutes of combat time, before they had to return for refueling. British fighters could fly over their own territory for as long as they wanted. Secondly, the British had an early warning system, a network of radar stations built along the southern and eastern coasts of England as part of the Chain Home program. These stations could detect approaching German formations at a range of up to 100 kilometers, giving the RAF time to scramble fighters and direct them to intercept. This was a revolutionary technology, which Germany did not have on such a large scale. The Germans were often unaware that the British were already aware of their approach. Third, the British had an excellent command and control system. Air Marshal Hugh Dowding, the commander-in-chief of the Fighter Command, developed an integrated defense system that combined data from radars, observation posts, and airfields into a single picture of the air situation. This allowed the British command to effectively deploy fighters, sending them where they were most needed and avoiding unnecessary expenditure of resources. Fourth, the British had excellent fighters. The Supermarine Spitfire and Hawker Hurricane were modern aircraft capable of countering the German Bf-109. The Spitfire was particularly good, fast, maneuverable, and well-armed. Many German pilots later admitted they underestimated the Spitfire. The Hurricane, although slightly slower, was reliable and effective, especially against German bombers. The Battle of Britain officially began on July 10, 1940, when the Luftwaffe began intensive raids on British convoys, ports, and coastal targets. This was reconnaissance in force, an attempt to draw the RAF into the fight and assess its strength. The intensity of the raids increased over the following weeks. August 13th, a day the Germans called Adlertag, Eagle Day, was planned as the start of the decisive offensive. The Luftwaffe carried out over 1,500 sorties, attacking airfields, radar stations, and other military targets. But the results were disappointing. The RAF wasn't destroyed. British fighters continued to take off, continued to fight, continued to shoot down German aircraft. Losses on both sides were high, but the British were able to replace their losses faster than the Germans because they were defending their territory and because their industry was operating at full capacity, producing new aircraft. August 18, 1940, was one of the bloodiest days of the Battle of Britain. The Luftwaffe launched massive raids on British airfields. German bombers, escorted by fighters, attacked several key airfields in southern England. The RAF scrambled to repel the attacks. The air battles were fierce. By the end of the day, the Germans had lost 69 aircraft, the British 39. This was an unacceptable loss ratio for the Luftwaffe. If such losses continued, the Luftwaffe would be exhausted long before the RAF was destroyed. By the end of August, it was clear the original plan was failing. The RAF had not been destroyed. British airfields, although damaged, continued to function. Radar stations, despite several attacks, remained operational. British fighters continued to fly. Göring was forced to admit that his estimates had been overly optimistic. He had promised Hitler the destruction of the RAF in 2 to 4 weeks, but 6 weeks had already passed, and the RAF was still fighting. The pressure on Göring was mounting. Hitler was losing patience. The invasion date, originally planned for mid-August, was postponed until early September, then to mid-September. Each postponement meant the window of opportunity was closing. September in the English Channel marks the beginning of autumn storms. After the end of September, an invasion would be impossible until the following year. Göring understood that he had to change his tactics to achieve a decisive result. In late August 1940, Hermann Göring made a decision that historians would later call one of the greatest strategic mistakes of the Battle of Britain. Instead of continuing attacks on British airfields and radar stations, targets that were truly weakening the RAF, Göring ordered a shift in focus to bombing British cities, especially London. This decision was made partly out of strategic considerations, partly out of emotion, and partly out of a misreading of the situation. Göring's logic was this: If the Luftwaffe bombed London and other major cities, it would cause panic among the civilian population, undermine British morale, and force the British government to sue for peace. Furthermore, bombing cities would force the RAF to scramble all its fighters to defend the capital, and then the Luftwaffe would be able to destroy them in aerial combat. Göring was certain this would hasten the end of the RAF. But this decision was wrong for several reasons. First, the bombing of cities did not break British morale. On the contrary, it strengthened the British population's resolve to resist. Winston Churchill, speaking to the nation, called for fortitude. His famous words, "We will fight on the beaches, we will fight in the streets, we will never surrender," resonated with the British. The bombing did not break the British, it united them. Secondly, switching to city bombing gave the RAF a critical respite. By the end of August, British airfields had been seriously damaged. Pilot losses were high. The RAF was at its limit. A few more weeks of intensive attacks on airfields, and the RAF could have been seriously weakened. But when the Luftwaffe switched to city bombing, the pressure on the airfields eased. The British had time to repair damaged airfields, replace losses, and reorganize their defenses. The first major bombing raid on London occurred on September 7, 1940. About 350 German bombers, escorted by fighters, attacked the east side of London, the docks, and industrial areas. Fires broke out throughout the city. About 430 people were killed, and more than 1,600 were injured. It was a horrific blow. But the RAF was not destroyed. British fighters took off and attacked German formations. The Germans lost about 40 aircraft that day. The bombing of London continued night after night. It was a campaign the British called the Blitz. Thousands of British civilians died. Districts of London were devastated. But the RAF fought on. British fighters scrambled every day, attacking German bombers and shooting them down. The Luftwaffe's losses mounted. September 15, 1940, was a decisive day in the Battle of Britain. The Luftwaffe launched two massive raids on London. The first occurred in the morning. About 200 bombers, escorted by fighters, headed for London. The RAF scrambled with all available forces. The air battles were fierce. German formations were attacked by wave after wave of British fighters. Many German bombers were shot down before they reached London. The second raid occurred in the afternoon, about 150 more bombers. The RAF scrambled again. More fierce fighting. By the end of the day, the Germans had lost approximately 60 aircraft, although the British initially inflated the figures, claiming 185 aircraft shot down. The British lost around 30 aircraft. This was an unacceptable loss ratio for the Luftwaffe. Göring realized his strategy was failing. The RAF had not been destroyed. British fighters continued to take off, continued to fight, and continued to inflict losses. On September 17, 1940, Hitler held a meeting with Göring and other commanders. The results of the Battle of Britain were discussed. It was clear that the Luftwaffe had failed to achieve air superiority. The RAF continued to operate. British airfields were operational. Radars warned of approaching German aircraft. An invasion under such conditions would be suicidal. Hitler made a decision. Operation Sea Lion was postponed indefinitely. Göring's mistake cost Germany the opportunity to invade Britain. Had the Luftwaffe continued attacks on British airfields and radar stations throughout August and September, the RAF could have been seriously weakened. But switching to city bombing gave the British a respite. It was a strategic mistake that changed the course of the war. The Battle of Britain became Germany's first major defeat in World War II. While the Luftwaffe fought in the skies above Britain, feverish preparations for the invasion fleet were underway in the ports of northern France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. The Kriegsmarine faced an incredibly complex task. Within a few weeks, assemble and prepare hundreds of ships capable of transporting 100,000 troops, their weapons, tanks, artillery, and supplies across the English Channel. And all this with minimal resources and under constant British air and naval attack. By August 1940, the German command had requisitioned approximately 2,400 barges from across occupied Europe, 860 from Germany, 1,200 from the Netherlands and Belgium, and 350 from France. These were river barges designed to transport cargo along calm inland waterways, the Rhine, the canals of Holland and Belgium, and the rivers of France. They were not designed for sea conditions. They lacked a keel to stabilize them in rough seas. They had no motors. They had to be towed. Their hulls were weak and easily damaged by waves. German engineers attempted to modify these barges. Some were equipped with ramps for disembarking tanks and soldiers. Others had their sides reinforced to protect them from waves. Still others were fitted with temporary motors to increase mobility. But these were improvised. No one knew how effective these modifications would be in real maritime conditions. Kriegsmarine officers were extremely skeptical. Admiral Raeder repeatedly warned that these barges were not designed to cross the English Channel. He wrote in his reports, "These vessels can only operate in absolutely calm water. Even a slight swell, waves of 1-2 meters, can capsize them or sink them. If there is any swell on the day of the invasion, we will lose most of the fleet before we even reach the British coast." In addition to the barges, the German command requisitioned approximately 1,700 motor launches and tugs to tow the barges, about 170 transport ships to transport supplies, and several warships for escort. But even this entire fleet was insufficient to defend against the British Royal Navy. The British had over 100 destroyers, dozens of cruisers, and battleships. If the British fleet broke through to the invasion fleet, the carnage would be horrific. The plan called for the barges to be sent in waves. The first wave, approximately 700 barges carrying 90,000 troops, was to cross the English Channel overnight, land at dawn, and seize a beachhead. The second wave, another 1,000 barges carrying tanks, artillery, and additional troops, was to follow a few hours later. The third wave, provisions, ammunition, and fuel. The entire process was to be completed in 3 to 4 days, after which the entire invasion force would be on the British shore. But this plan depended on many factors that could not be guaranteed. First, the weather. The English Channel is known for its storms and unpredictable conditions. Even in summer, sudden storms can arise, creating high waves. Second, the British fleet. Even if the Luftwaffe gained air superiority, the British fleet might attempt to break through to the invasion fleet at night, when German aircraft could not operate effectively. Third, British aircraft. Even weakened, the RAF could attack barges with bombs and torpedoes. The gathering of barges in ports did not go unnoticed by the British. The RAF conducted regular reconnaissance flights over the French coast. Photographs showed hundreds of barges assembled in the ports of Boulogne, Calais, Dunkirk, and Ostend. British command immediately realized that an invasion was underway. The RAF began regular bombing raids on these ports. Nighttime bombing of ports became regular. British bombers, Wellingtons, Hamptons, and Whitleys, carried out raids, dropping bombs on clusters of barges. Many barges were sunk or damaged. German engineers repaired them, but further raids inflicted further damage. By September, approximately 10–15% of the invasion fleet had been lost to British bombing. Hitler and his generals understood that time was running out. Every week of delay meant worsening weather conditions. August gave way to September. Autumn storms were beginning. The invasion window was rapidly closing. The invasion date was first set for September 15th, then moved to September 20th, then to September 24. But the Luftwaffe never achieved air superiority. The RAF fought on. September 1940. Operation Sea Lion was scheduled to begin any day now. Barges were assembled in ports. Troops were ready. The plan had been developed. But there was one factor no one could control: the weather. And this factor was becoming critical to the fate of the entire operation. The English Channel is one of the most dangerous and unpredictable straits in the world. Even in summer, conditions can quickly deteriorate, and September marks the beginning of the autumn storm season. German meteorologists warned command of the risks. Their forecasts showed that the likelihood of storms and high waves increased significantly in September. The English Channel is known for its tides. The difference between high and low tides can reach 6 to 7 meters. Currents are strong and unpredictable. Winds can suddenly increase, creating waves 2 to 3 meters high, and sometimes even higher. For river barges loaded with soldiers and equipment, such conditions are deadly. Admiral Raeder repeatedly emphasized this problem in his reports to Hitler. He wrote, "For a successful crossing of the English Channel, we need ideal weather conditions, a calm sea, waves no higher than 0.51 meter, and light winds. If the waves are stronger, the barges will begin to capsize or sink. We could lose half the invasion fleet before we even reach the British coast. And such ideal conditions are rare, especially in September." The operation was originally planned for September 15, 1940. This was the date Hitler considered optimal, enough time for the Luftwaffe to gain air superiority before the worst autumn weather set in. But as the date approached, it became clear that conditions were unfavorable. The Luftwaffe failed to achieve air superiority. The RAF continued to fight, and weather forecasts showed worsening weather conditions. On September 17, 1940, Hitler held a conference with his commanders. The results were disappointing. Göring reported that the Luftwaffe had failed to destroy the RAF, that British fighters continued to take off, and that German air losses were too high. Raeder reported that the invasion fleet was ready, but that weather conditions were deteriorating daily, with the likelihood of storms increasing. Barges reported that the ground forces were ready, but that without air superiority and favorable weather, the operation was doomed. Hitler decided to postpone the operation. A new date was set for September 20th. But as September 20th approached, the situation hadn't improved. A series of storms began over the English Channel. Waves reached 3 to 4 meters high. The wind increased. Visibility was poor. In such conditions, even attempting to send barges would have been suicidal. The operation was postponed again to September 24th. RAF pilots flying over the French coast saw hundreds of barges moored in ports, awaiting orders to depart. British command knew an invasion could occur at any moment. All available forces were scrambled. The Navy was on full alert, fighters were on duty at airfields, and troops were stationed along the southern coast. Britain was expecting an invasion, but the invasion never happened. On September 24th, the weather was unfavorable again. The storm continued. The waves were high. Raeder reported to Hitler that an operation was impossible in such conditions. Even if they tried to send barges, most of the fleet would be swamped by the waves before the British Navy or Air Force could attack. It would be a disaster. Friedrich Paulus, who was deputy chief of the General Staff of the Army at the time, later recalled, "Starting in October 1940, the planned invasion dates were continually pushed back, until finally the message arrived that, due to the onset of bad autumn weather, an operation in 1940 was impossible. This was an official admission that the window of opportunity had closed. The weather was one of the decisive factors that saved Britain from invasion. Even if the Luftwaffe had achieved air superiority, even if the invasion fleet had been ready, the September storms would have made the operation incredibly risky. The river barges, overloaded with soldiers and equipment, were not designed for such conditions. Many would have capsized or sunk. The losses would have been catastrophic." The British understood this. Winston Churchill later wrote in his memoirs, "The Germans underestimated the English Channel. This strait was our ally. Its waves, its storms, its unpredictability, all this worked against the enemy. Even if they had tried to cross, the sea would have destroyed them as effectively as our fleet." One of the reasons Hitler didn't push Operation Sea Lion as hard as one might expect was his fundamental illusion about Great Britain. The Führer considered the British racially close to the Germans, part of the Aryan race. He believed that sooner or later, the British would realize the futility of continuing the war and agree to peace with Germany. This illusion influenced his strategic decisions and ultimately saved Britain from invasion. In his book Mein Kampf, written in the 1920s, Hitler repeatedly expressed his admiration for the British Empire. He wrote that Britain was an example of the successful domination of a superior race over inferior peoples, and that the British colonial system was a model that Germany should emulate in Eastern Europe. Hitler believed that there was no fundamental conflict of interest between Germany and Britain. Germany could dominate continental Europe, while Britain could dominate the seas and colonies. This idea permeated Hitler's entire foreign policy toward Britain. Even after the war began, he continued to hope for peace. After France's capitulation in June 1940, Hitler expected Britain to understand the hopelessness of its situation and agree to negotiations. He was prepared to offer Britain lenient terms: preservation of the empire, recognition of German hegemony in Europe, and perhaps even an alliance against the USSR. On July 19, 1940, speaking to the Reichstag, Hitler made what he considered a final appeal to reason. He said, "I see no reason to continue this struggle. I feel obliged to my conscience to once again appeal to England to reason." The Führer sincerely believed the British would accept his proposal, but Churchill rejected it. British Foreign Secretary Lord Halifax officially declared that Britain would continue the fight until complete victory. Friedrich Paulus, interrogated by Soviet investigators after the war, cited 4 reasons why Hitler continually delayed the invasion. The first was the risk of loss of prestige in the event of failure. The second was the hope that Britain would be prepared to capitulate under the mere threat of invasion, coupled with submarine attacks and bombing raids. Third, and this is crucial, was the illusory calculation that by inflicting little damage on the enemy, an alliance could be concluded with him later. The fourth was Hitler's clear intention to attack the USSR. This third reason reveals Hitler's fundamental illusion. He didn't want to destroy Britain. He wanted it to become his ally. So he hesitated, delayed the invasion, and hoped for a diplomatic solution. Even when it became clear that Churchill wouldn't negotiate, Hitler continued to hope that British public opinion would force the government to change its position. This explains why Hitler didn't push Operation Sea Lion more forcefully. For him, an invasion of Britain wasn't so much a necessity as a threat, a lever. He hoped that the mere threat of invasion, combined with bombing and a U-boat blockade, would force the British to capitulate. When that didn't work, he wasn't prepared to risk everything for an operation whose success he doubted. As early as July 1940, parallel to planning for Operation Sea Lion, Hitler began considering Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. For the Führer, the USSR was a true enemy, an ideological adversary, a territory to be conquered to gain living space. Britain was an irritant, but not the primary target. By the fall of 1940, Hitler's priorities had finally shifted east. Wehrmacht generals, including Brauchitsch and Halder, saw this shift in priorities. They understood that the Führer no longer believed in Operation Sea Lion. His focus was on the USSR. When the Battle of Britain reached a stalemate, when the weather worsened, when it became clear that an invasion in 1940 was impossible, Hitler wasn't particularly upset. He was already thinking of other plans. Hitler's illusion about the possibility of an alliance with Britain was one of the factors that saved the country. Had the Führer been more decisive, had he viewed Britain as an enemy to be destroyed at any cost, he might have insisted on the operation despite the risks. But he hesitated, hoped, and delayed. And this gave Britain time to survive. On October 12, 1940, Adolf Hitler issued an order that effectively spelled the end of Operation Sea Lion for 1940. The order stated, "Operation Sea Lion is postponed until the spring of 1941. Technically, this wasn't a cancellation, but a postponement. But in practice, it meant the invasion of Britain would not take place for the foreseeable future. The window of opportunity had closed. Autumn storms made the English Channel impassable for river barges. The next opportunity wouldn't be until May-June 1941. But by the spring of 1941, Hitler's priorities had completely shifted. On December 18, 1940, the Führer issued Directive Number 21, in order to prepare for Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. The operation's start date was set for June 1941. This meant that all Wehrmacht resources, troops, aircraft, tanks, supplies, were to be transferred to the east. Operation Sea Lion was postponed indefinitely. In the ports of northern France, the barges assembled for the invasion began to rot. Some were damaged by British bombing, others were simply crumbling from time and weather. The Kriegsmarine began returning the barges to their owners. Troops preparing for the invasion were transferred to Germany to prepare for Operation Barbarossa. By the spring of 1941, only a small portion of the invasion fleet remained. On June 22, 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa began. 3 million German soldiers, thousands of tanks, and thousands of aircraft moved east. The entire focus of the German war machine shifted to the Eastern Front. Britain was no longer the main problem. Hitler was convinced that after the defeat of the USSR, Britain would agree to peace on its own. But Operation Sea Lion wasn't officially canceled until January 1942. On January 9, 1942, after it became clear that the blitzkrieg in the USSR had failed and that the war in the East would drag on, Hitler officially ordered a halt to all preparations for the invasion of Britain. On February 13, 1942, Admiral Raeder spoke with Hitler for the last time about Operation Sea Lion and convinced him to agree to a complete cessation of all activity in this direction. The British learned of the operation's cancellation through intelligence and intercepts. The tension that had kept British society in a state of constant readiness since the summer of 1940 began to subside. Troops stationed along the southern coast to repel the invasion were redeployed to other theaters of war, North Africa and the Middle East. Britain survived. There was no invasion. Why did Operation Sea Lion fail? Historians identify several key reasons. First, the Luftwaffe's failure in the Battle of Britain. Germany failed to achieve air superiority, which was absolutely essential for the invasion's success. The RAF, despite significant losses, continued to fight and maintain control of the skies over Britain. Secondly, the Kriegsmarine's weakness. Germany lacked a sufficient navy to protect the invasion fleet from the British Royal Navy. Even with air superiority, British ships could attack barges at night, when German aircraft were ineffective. Admiral Raeder repeatedly warned of this problem, but his warnings were ignored. Third, inadequate equipment. The river barges requisitioned for the invasion fleet were not designed for sea conditions. Even a relatively small wave could capsize or sink them. German engineers attempted to modify them, but this was improvised and could not guarantee safety. Fourth, the weather. September storms in the English Channel made the operation impossible. The waves were too high, the wind too strong. Even if all other conditions had been favorable, the weather alone could have thwarted the invasion. Fifth, and perhaps most importantly, Hitler's hesitation. The Führer wasn't convinced of the need for an invasion. He hoped for a diplomatic solution, for Britain to capitulate voluntarily. His attention was already on the USSR. He wasn't prepared to risk everything for an operation whose success he doubted. This hesitation gave Britain critical time to prepare for defense. Operation Sea Lion was Nazi Germany's first major strategic failure in World War II. Until then, the Wehrmacht had seemed invincible. Poland, Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, and France were all crushed within weeks or months. But Britain stood firm. And this fact had enormous psychological significance for the entire world. When the war ended in 1945 and historians began to analyze the events of 1940, it became clear that Britain had escaped invasion not thanks to a single factor, but a whole series of factors, many of which were accidental or dependent on the enemy's poor decisions. This doesn't diminish the courage of British pilots, Churchill's determination, or the effectiveness of Britain's defense. But it does demonstrate that history is often determined not only by heroism, but also by chance, mistakes, and circumstances beyond anyone's control. The first fortuitous factor was the weather. If September 1940 had been a calm month, with good weather and calm seas, the invasion might have taken place, despite all the other problems. But September brought storms, high waves, and poor visibility. The English Channel became impassable for river barges. This was a factor no one could have foreseen or controlled. The weather saved Britain as effectively as the RAF or the Royal Navy. The second factor was Göring's mistake. The Luftwaffe's switch from attacking airfields to bombing cities was a strategic error of enormous proportions. By late August 1940, the RAF was at its limit. Airfields were damaged, pilot losses were high, and reserves were depleted. Another 2 to 3 weeks of intensive airfield attacks, and the RAF could have been seriously weakened. But Göring switched to cities, giving the RAF a critical respite. This was a mistake that changed the course of the Battle of Britain. The third factor was Hitler's illusions. The Führer believed that the British were racially close to the Germans, that they would understand the futility of continuing the war and agree to peace. This illusion caused him to hesitate, postpone decisions, and hope for a diplomatic solution. If Hitler had viewed Britain as an enemy to be destroyed at any cost, he might have insisted on an invasion, despite all the risks. But he hesitated, and this hesitation bought Britain time. The fourth factor was technical unpreparedness. Germany was a continental power, optimized for land operations. It had no experience with large-scale amphibious operations. It had no specialized landing craft. The river barges were improvised and could not guarantee success. Had Germany possessed a powerful navy and specialized landing craft, similar to those the Allies would develop by 1944, the operation might have had a greater chance of success. The fifth factor was a shift in priorities. As early as late 1940, Hitler began planning an invasion of the USSR. For him, the Soviet Union was the real enemy, a territory to be conquered. Britain was a secondary concern. When it became clear that an invasion of Britain in 1940 was impossible, Hitler shifted his attention to the east. Operation Barbarossa became the priority, and Operation Sea Lion was forgotten. Britain survived not only thanks to the courage of its pilots, though their role was critical. It survived thanks to technology, radar stations that provided early warning of approaching German formations. It survived thanks to tactics, Dowding's integrated defense system, which allowed for the efficient allocation of limited resources. It survived thanks to industry that produced new aircraft faster than the Germans could shoot them down. But it also survived thanks to enemy mistakes, to chance, to factors no one could control. If Göring hadn't switched to bombing cities, if the weather in September had been favorable, if Hitler had been more decisive, history might have turned out differently. The invasion might have taken place, and the consequences would have been catastrophic for Britain and the entire world. Operation Sea Lion was a turning point in World War II. It was Nazi Germany's first major defeat. Until then, it seemed the Wehrmacht was invincible, that nothing could stop the German war machine. But the failure of Operation Sea Lion demonstrated that Germany had its limits, that the German army was not omnipotent, and that resistance was possible and effective. This had enormous psychological significance. For the British, it was proof that they could endure, that their sacrifices had not been in vain. For the rest of the world, including the United States, which had not yet entered the war, it was proof that Germany could be defeated. This strengthened their resolve to continue the fight. Ultimately, Operation Sea Lion is the story of how a series of accidents, mistakes, and circumstances prevented the largest invasion in European history. It's a story of how wars are not always won by the strongest army, but by the one underestimated, the one blessed with the weather, the one whose enemy made critical mistakes. Sometimes the outcome of history is determined not by heroism, but by chance. and in 1940, chance was on Britain's side.